What is going on, y'all? The Golden Gauntlet is happening right now. Here are some of my favorite decks from the Golden Gauntlet World Championship. We're going to start with the only Cerebro 3 deck in the field, and it's one of the few decks in this field that I had a direct hand in helping to create. Zapgaze, Monty Devoody, you might be familiar with him if you're a Magic player, is one of the commentators for Magic the Gathering. He is a friend of mine from a bit back, and we decided that he should be playing something like Cerebro 3 or Mr. Negative because he's just not really as familiar with the way Marvel Snap works, but he's a really talented card game player, so the goal is just put up a good finish rather than like super metagaming to be like, I'm gonna win this whole tournament, which as of the time of recording is still on the table. When I checked, he was undefeated at 4-0 at the time of recording this. This is a list that he ended up on. You saw the previous version of it where it was a Lockjaw M'Baku list that he and I worked on. I put him in touch with Jay Walla. He ended up playing Jay Walla's list. That's what you're seeing right here. And it is, as far as I'm aware, the only Cerebro 3 deck in the field and undefeated at the time I am recording this. So we're definitely going to start with that. Huge shout out to Monty. This is a super cool way to try to approach a metagame like this, because one of the things that happens in metagames like this is a lot of really good players are involved, and there was a bit of a tendency to sort of not necessarily default to comfort picks, but to sort of chase agency. And one of the things you'll notice is as I talk about some of the good players who put decks together for this event, there's just kind of going to be a lot of people who are playing not necessarily like do-nothing mid-range decks, but mid-range decks that are just sort of awkwardly positioned, looking for their specific tech cards all the time. And Cerebro 3 is an absolute crusher of that kind of stuff. This is a deck that will eat all of the comfort picks alive. If you are not coming fully prepared to be all combo all the time, you are not going to be able to deal with this. A special shout out to the Rogue, who I think is a pretty good reasonable way at making sure your opponent's Madam Webs keep their point total just a bit lower, and that keeps the move decks in the range of what you would be trying to do in order to beat them as a Cerebro deck. M'Baku still makes the cut, Lockjaw doesn't. The argument there that was convincing to both Monty and myself from Jay Walla was that the Lockjaw is not really going to help you win in many of those cases where you're looking to go get just a Cerebro, because it's very unlikely that just a Cerebro is going to get you enough points. The main reason you should be playing Cerebro 3 is because it's the best Cerebro deck at playing multiple Cerebros, and that is the strength you should be leaning into, not winning the games where you don't draw Cerebro. So that's the idea, and so far it seems to have been working very, very well. Speaking of extremely fair mid-range piles, we're going to start with W's list, which I absolutely love. I love the idea that you can play just a bunch of extremely fair cards with some reasonable interaction, just some energy cheat. We're a Shadow King deck. We're doing Hood Killmonger. We have the ability to play Enchantress. We have a Cosmic Ghost Rider. This is a full-on tech deck. And while I think that it's likely to run into some unpleasant matchups in the near future, there is a lot to be said about just being able to play a deck like this. W is a player who has sort of quietly come back into Marvel Snap, someone who was a bigger name at the start for anyone who remembers the sort of 5-drop focus Thanos deck when the Time Stone was a Psylocke and you just try to like cheat out Spider-Man when he got rid of Lanes and Professor X and generally be a horrendous deck. That is a W deck, and it seems fitting that he's got something similar going on here. A lot of ramp into 5s. Like, they're the functional difference between old Time Stone into a 5-drop and current Penny Parker into a 5-drop. They're actually quite similar in terms of ethos. I think that through line is very funny to note in his deck building. This is a deck for those of you that are looking for, I guess I would describe this as comfort food. Not even like a comfort pick, but like this is like old school Marvel Snap. This is some 2023 Marvel Snap. If you've been playing Marvel Snap for a while and you're tired of how the game is going, this is the kind of thing that can give you that feeling back, I think. It's a very interesting, very cool deck that I think is a really sort of classic W brainchild. Another player who chose to play exactly what he's known for is Fudge. Fudge has always been best when piloting decks like this, almost down to the exact cards throughout multiple metagames. It's sad to see Fenris Wolf go, but as an original Luna Snow believer, it's nice to see him still kicking around the Luna Snow mid-range decks for some Luna Snow value. This is the classic. A destroy-based mid-range deck that looks to have a little bit more points against other mid-range decks and use interaction like Lady Deathstrike and Killmonger and Shadow King in order to deal with the major point output of other lists. It can happen. This is a deck that has a lot of tools that can line up properly. When I play it, I'm often struck by how often they don't line up properly. I think Merlin goes a long way towards just easing your draws and making sure you're using all your energy because you don't have a lot of inbuilt points here. You need to find those points from your interaction. And so you run into some decks where it's like, all right, well, I'm really favored if I draw the Shadow King, don't draw the Shadow King. I'm really favored if I draw the Killmonger, don't draw the Killmonger. That dynamic is part of what's pushing the metagame away from these sort of heavier tech decks and towards these more combo-y decks that have a little bit more redundancy built in. It's quite interesting to note, although those combo decks still have plenty of things where it's like, oh, I didn't draw the Human Torch, I don't reach my ceiling, but you have Dagger as a backup. The rest of your deck is cards that move. You didn't draw Madam Web. That's not good. You're still going to be able to play the game. You didn't draw Human Torch. That's not good. You're still going to be able to play the game. Whereas in those matchups against those decks, you didn't draw Shadow King. You're not going to be able to play the game. And I think that is the most interesting thing about the way this deck functions. You'd think that the mid-range decks are like a more consistent thing, but because of the duplication ability or the relative redundancy in the combo decks, it doesn't actually end up being true. And so that's a really interesting thing to note. When enough of the matchups are stressing you're having one specific card, it's not as easy as you might think to be a consistent list. Cougar audibled to Cerebro 4 on the power of Shadow King and, of course, our girl, Mercury. Now, this is a list that exists purely at the sufferance of Mercury. Like, that's the whole thing that this list is doing. Mercury is a 4. Shadow King is a 4. You want to play both of those cards. What is the best place to play both of those cards? Cougar asked himself that question and came up with this deck. And that is, I think, a very reasonable answer. But this is a super temporal deck. This deck does not have universal lasting staying power. It is entirely down to the two most relevant tech cards in this metagame being those two cards, and they happen to fit in this Cerebro deck. A few weeks ago, this was true of Cerebro 2, and Cerebro 2 would have been the deck that he chose if those cards still fit in that deck. They don't. They fit in C4 now. He took C4. It's a reasonably powerful deck that lines up well into the metagame and has enough free wins in it that you're happy to just rely on the tech cards against those matchups that are very awkward for you. The power output is high. You can get screwed by some locations, but it's still okay. There's been a lot of talk about Storm War Machine Legion, but a member of my Discord named ELA, who has been a constant presence as a member of my community, who has been playing this deck for months. This has been sort of his baby as he's worked toward it, and what you'll notice is it's quite different from a lot of other Storm War Machine Legion decks. It's a lot more front-loaded. There's a lot more cheap stuff in here, a lot more early tempo in here. Juggernaut is in here. It's really front-loaded. There's interactive tools, too. This is a Cosmic Ghost Rider deck. This is a Juggernaut deck. This is a Mercury deck. It's a very sort of tempo-based take on the archetype, and so far, he has done quite well with it. He qualified in the last Golden Gauntlet qualifier. He's done quite well so far today at the time of recording, I believe, and I think this is an actually pretty interesting take on the archetype, where many of the archetypes that are similar to this are backloaded. They're Doctor Doom, Electro kind of Jubilee things, where you're doing Blink-type stuff. This one is saying, I'm front-loading it, I'm playing for tempo, I'm gonna be ahead, and I'm gonna shut the game down, and that's just gonna be how I play. I think that's a really interesting way to build for this, especially because you can then rely on Infinite to just be a really big guy. The interaction is where I think this gets really interesting, though, because if you're going to play it all front-loaded, you need to be sure that you have the correct interaction pieces to prevent people from going over the top of you, because when you front-load your power, you're playing cheaper cards, which are going to necessarily have less power overall than the more expensive ones. So Cosmic Ghost Rider and Mercury are going to have to do a lot of work here, but in terms of shells for Cosmic Ghost Rider and Mercury, if you flip your thinking about this deck, this might actually be just a really good shell for CGR and Merc, and that might actually be what the metagame calls for. When I talked about good players just sort of defaulting to like simple-ish, straightforward, relatively limited in terms of output mid-range list, I think this is a great example. Honifer is, as always, doing very well with this exact piece of cardboard, I suppose, digital cardboard. These exact 12 cards, if you count Agamotto's spells, more than 12, have been a sort of Honifer staple for, I don't know, 6 months. He's just been willing to bring this out when he feels like he doesn't necessarily have a great idea as to what this exact best deck is. And in Worlds, he's defaulted to his comfort pick, and so far it's done pretty well for him at the time of recording. I believe either 4-0 or 3-1. A really, really solid record here. I think that this is another example. Like, you group this with W, you group this with Fudge. This is someone playing a comfort pick. And I think it sort of goes to speak to like why I thought Cerebro would be a good choice for Mani to bring. The largest reason for that is that it's not a deck that requires so much of you, but it has a lot of free wins built in, such that you can probably get a solid performance out of it without a ton of experience. And if you're a smart enough card game player, you should just be able to put up a pretty decent, there's like a high floor, I feel like, on a Cerebro deck in a tournament setting, because there's just going to be so many matchups where your opponents have absolutely nothing for you because they're playing stuff like this. Now, granted, Viper isn't out. You can Viper and ruin the Cerebro here, but this sort of type of deck is very straightforwardly like, if you're not doing your meaningful disruption via Clog, it's kind of awkward. And I think that this is a deck that is a very comfortable pick for Honifer, but I don't think he would tell you that he thinks it's the best deck in the game. I think he just thinks the metagame is diffuse enough that he wants something that he has experience on that other people don't necessarily have experience on. The other cool thing that this deck gets to do is use new debris, which is amazing, because this is a Viper deck. This is an Annihilus with Yellow Jacket deck. There's like the only deck that actually really gets to do Clog stuff with new debris is this list, which is really cool, a really nice adaptation. I think that this deck has a chance at being what Clog could look like in the future, because it's not only using debris for Clog, it's using debris for fuel, for your Agamotto Images of Icon spell, right? It's using all of this stuff for various things, but it's also a good follow-up to Iron Patriot. It's a good fuel for Merlin. This is a deck that's really actually set up to do that, and I think it's nice to see a newly OTA'd card performing in a really powerful way. We got another comfort pick gamer here. It's Denish on Hela, to absolutely nobody's surprise. This is a list he's been working on for a while now. It is an anti-combo Hela deck. Hela is pretty poorly positioned in this metagame, to be completely honest with you. It gets a lot better positioned the more people are playing sort of those mid-rangey fallback decks, but it's very poorly positioned against all the combo decks. So this is a deck that has sort of the same profile as Cerebro, I think, where it's like you just have a lot of wins that are built in against these mid-rangey fallbacks, but you don't have nearly as much against someone who is actually just comboing out on you. And I think it's relevant that this deck is doing, I believe, pretty well right now, because I think of these mid-rangey fallback lists. And you see that that sort of seems to be the way the metagame is shaping up, where there's like more mid-rangey fallback lists in this field than you'd think, which means that decks like Cerebro, decks like Hela, decks like Arishem, that are the sort of next level up from those decks, are doing pretty well. Hela, if Denish is right about this, could be able to middle this metagame pretty well. If this anti-combo stuff works as well as he thinks it does, this could be a real position where it's a deck that has the inbuilt ability to beat mid-range decks by having a bunch of points, and then also the disruptive tools to beat combo with Supergiant and Eliath. It remains to be seen if that actually holds up, but I do think it's a really interesting direction to take the list. So far, everyone in this video has been someone that I know, I talk to, they're a high-level player. This is a player I don't recognize, but I really liked their list. The player's name is ACP, and they took what looks to me to be the best version of the zombie deck that I've seen. This is a perfect balance of interactivity and power. You have the ability to double up on the things that you need to double up on. You have a little bit of interactivity in the form of Spider-Ham, in the form of Mercury, in the form of Cannonball. That should be not necessarily enough, but it's enough to say you're making a real effort at having interactive tools going forward. And you have the doubling up of points in the form of Absorbing Man. This is just a list that I look at and I'm impressed with and I think is really good. I think it is really well put together. I think it is an extremely solid build. And it's probably, of all of the lists that I've talked about, the one that I am most likely to play because this is the kind of player that I am. This is a very clean 12. I really like what's gone into this list, and it looks to me just like a well-oiled machine that balances interactivity with point output in a really powerful way. I think it's really solid. You know we had to talk about some Arishem, so this is Teebs' build of Arishem Thanos. No Agamotto in here. And what I really want to highlight is specifically the cards that were chosen as tech pieces, because a lot of the time people just jam whatever tech cards in Arishem. It's a little harder to do that. Legion is a card that goes in a lot of Arishem decks because it's just naturally really good when you can accelerate it. You can get free wins out of that. Death's Domain, obviously, things of that nature. But looking at the other specific tech pieces, Mercury, Cosmic Ghost Rider, Shadow King, Enchantress, those are the relevant ones. And I think that it's important that Arishem just like randomly have the chance to blow out every matchup that it runs into because it's impossible for your opponents to really know what you're snapping on. Also, as we've talked about, this is a tournament that is having a lot more of these sort of mid-rangey fallback lists show up. Arishem is naturally good into that kind of stuff. So when you have your natural good matchups, again, sort of the idea here is similar actually to the Hela deck, where it's like we have our naturally good matchups against these mid-range decks. We also have the ability to blow out all the combo decks because we run all these tech cards. And they have no idea if we have that or not. They are always in the sort of morass of, oh God, what does this actually mean? When I played on ladder, I had an Arishem deck snap on me in the final turn of the game. And it's like, that could mean literally anything. In the game I played, it meant that there was a Sanctum Sanctorum and my opponent had randomly generated a Doctor Doom. I beat that, but it's impossible to know what that snap meant. And so it's just a very difficult situation for you to put your opponents in. This is a really interesting Arishem list, and honestly, I think it's my favorite of the Arishem lists that I've seen enter this tournament. Arishem is naturally advantaged in Golden Gauntlet type stuff because of the way in which it has the ability to leverage the system of open deck lists by having no open deck list, effectively, because of the randomly generated cards. It's a uniquely powerful deck in Golden Gauntlet tournaments when there are open deck lists. People have asked me, what do you think about open deck lists? They are the correct decision. If there were not open deck lists, it would be very easy to cheat. It would be very hard to enforce what was actually supposed to be in decks. It's the correct decision to make these tournaments function, but it does have the natural conclusion of Arishem gets a little bit stronger in these tournaments than he is on ladder. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. If you're watching this within a couple hours of its release, I will probably be commentating the Golden Gauntlet when we get to the top bracket. Thank you so much. Please do stop by. I'll probably do Golden Gauntlet into my own stream. We'll see how that goes. Thanks so much. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Have a wonderful day. And, roll Tide.